My name is Anish Gopala, and I'm happy to partner today with the Santa Clara County Library District to present to you the story of France during the Second World War. So in 1939, when the Second World War began, France did not really want to attack Germany because they wanted to avoid a repeat of the horrific casualties and trench warfare where you have terrible living conditions for soldiers, casualties in the millions, and overall just a lot of internal outrage over what's being done to soldiers on the front. They really wanted to avoid a repeat of that. So they decided to kind of not go straight into the war and attack Germany, even though they had declared war on Germany. So yes, they were in war with Germany, but they did not want to attack the enemy, which went about as well as you would expect it to. It's important to note that that's not the only reason that they lost the war to Germany. Additionally, their army used outdated equipment, so orders from the commander-in-chief were generally very vague. They were not a fast army. They were not a mobile army, whereas the Germans were, and they were crushed due to that immobilization almost. So with all of those advantages, Germany was able to blitzkrieg through French territory and eventually take all of France. Blitzkrieg is what we will talk about on the next slide. So in English, blitzkrieg is lightning war, and it relies on speed, a lot on speed. So it consists of many techniques that it completely revolutionized the way that we think of the battlefield in the 20th century. But there are three main techniques that really contributed to its performance in the battlefield. So first of all, we give soldiers drugs that increase their performance, right? And make them almost superhuman because they're able to work night and day. They don't need rest. They don't need as much food. They have so much energy that they can just keep going. One of the drugs given to them was what is now known as crystallized methamphetamine, known on the streets as crystal meth. And this made them essentially unstoppable. But remember, there's a time limit. Eventually, once you've taken too much, it's not going to go well for your body. And we see that later in the war on a mass scale with so many soldiers having problems with their drugs, right? And the second tactic was to send refugees. And I'm not talking, a couple of groups of refugees. I'm talking thousands, if not millions of refugees. And this slows the enemy advance because remember, you can't run over the refugees. You've got to just wait for them to pass, right? And this made it very hard for French forces to be deployed out onto the front. Additionally, concentrating tanks and firepower. What this meant was that generally before World War II and the German invasion of France, generally tanks and cannons were spread out across the battlefield. The idea was that if you have a lot, you can have some everywhere, right? But what the Germans did was they had a little bit of a different idea. They decided to have many tanks, group them together, and just spearhead them straight into the enemy lines, as well as firepower. And so it's also important to note that what they did was, in Blitzkrieg, they would not send everything in at once. Generally, what we associate with the battle is tanks, manpower, planes, and cannons just all going at once. But Blitzkrieg was completely different in the sense that first you have the tanks going through, and then the planes, and then a huge onslaught of manpower or men, soldiers, moving into enemy territory. And through all of these extremely ingenious techniques, the Germans occupied France in just 5 days, which is an incredibly quick victory. And remember, for the German leadership, i.e. Adolf Hitler, this looks really good to have taken France, which was never done in the First World War, to have done it in just 5 days. So the German occupation of France. What the Germans did was that they did not want to immediately just take all of France and make it all an occupied zone. So the idea was that we're going to make the British, who were the French allies, they wanted to make the British feel as alone and isolated as possible. So they decided we're not just going to isolate all of France proper. Instead, we're going to divide it into two zones. The occupied zone, as we see on the top, and the free zone, which was not free at all. It was what is now known as Vichy France, or what was also then known as Vichy France, and it was basically just a puppet government. However, the British were not completely aware of this, so at times they may have thought like, oh, they've betrayed us, whereas in fact they were never betrayed by the French. It was just a sort of puppet government that was being run by the Germans. Additionally, the Atlantic Wall was built on what is now France proper, which is why you'll see that the occupied zone stretches all of the places where France borders the Atlantic Ocean and the English Channel. All of that is part of the occupied zone because the Germans wanted to build a wall here, a giant sea wall, so that no invasion could come into France. And we're going to see the failures of that wall later in the war. It was known as the Atlantic Wall, as I said. Atrocities all over Paris and just France in general. Atrocities were committed, right? There was one particularly infamous scene in which young men were sent into slave labor camps in Germany. And there was outrage at this, but nobody could do anything just due to the German military presence in France proper. And resistance groups, primarily the well-known French resistance, Vive la Résistance, these groups rose up to meet these threats. And up here is the flag of Vichy France, which was really just a puppet government. So during the invasion of France, the German or Nazi invasion of France, Charles de Gaulle, a commander of the French army, was able to flee to Britain. And from there, he gave these empowering, incredible speeches, which motivated people from across the world to come together and join the Free France movement, which was the idea of an army that would one day cross the English Channel and invade France. And we'll see how successful it really was later in the war. It was incredibly successful. And additionally, they had contacts with the French resistance, and they helped the French resistance plot their attacks from outside France, specifically Britain. The liberation of France. So what we see here is the failure of the Atlantic Wall. There were tons of security failures that happened that day, particularly Hitler was quite literally asleep while D-Day was happening, and Erwin Rommel, one of the generals assigned to help defend the Atlantic Wall, he was somewhere in Berlin, if I'm not mistaken, and he was celebrating his wife's birthday. So during D-Day, regardless of those two security failures, it was still a really arduous task to get this giant army into France proper. So through hundreds of hours and so much planning, the attack papers or the planning papers, the operational papers, were feet high. Incredible amounts of resources, millions of bullets, millions of shells as well, thousands of ships, millions of men were gathered to actually move across the channel. And with all of this, the Americans and the British and the Canadians, as well as Polish pilots and some Czech soldiers, some Czech legions, were able to pierce the Atlantic Wall, and they were able to retake France. So when France was taken, Charles de Gaulle, he was appointed as the president, and he made the Fourth French Republic. Now, you'll notice that actually today stands the Fifth French Republic because, long story short, after some French shenanigans, there was a change in government, and what happened was the Fifth French Republic was formed. And here we see the current president, Macron, who recently won to Le Pen in the French election, and their motto is Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité. I'm not sure if I got the pronunciation right there. And it stands as one of the most powerful democracies in the world and is incredibly important to international relations today. This is my bibliography. You can pause there if you want to look through my links, so on and so forth. Thank you for watching. It has been a pleasure to make this video. I hope you learned something new about the story of France during the Second World War. That is all. Goodbye.